Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Augusta, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the night of August 12, 1842, Catherine Pemberton, heiress to one of Georgia's largest cotton fortunes, sat across a mahogany gaming table from a man who, according to the laws of her state, was not even considered fully human. By dawn, she had lost everything. The plantation, the mansion, 52 human beings she claimed as property, and 3 generations of accumulated wealth. All transferred to Marcus, an enslaved carpenter, in a single roll of dice that witnesses would later describe as impossible, as if the dice themselves had been possessed by something beyond chance. What makes this account particularly disturbing is not the gambling itself, though that was shocking enough for a woman of her station, but rather what investigators discovered when they began to examine the circumstances surrounding that night. According to courthouse records unsealed in 1963, the game had been rigged. But not in the way anyone expected. The Pemberton family had established their presence in Richmond County, Georgia, in 1791, when Catherine's great-grandfather received a land grant of 600 acres along the Savannah River. Tax records from the Georgia Historical Society show that by 1820, the plantation had expanded to include extensive cotton fields, a 3-story federal-style mansion with Doric columns, and a workforce of 43 enslaved individuals whose names were recorded only as numbers in inventory ledgers. Catherine Pemberton was born in 1818, the only surviving child of Richard and Eleanor Pemberton. Parish records from St. Paul's Episcopal Church indicate that 2 older brothers had died in infancy, leaving Catherine as sole heir to the family fortune. This unusual circumstance shaped her upbringing in ways that would prove significant. According to the diary of Margaret Whitfield, a cousin who visited Pemberton Hall in the summer of 1835, Catherine was being educated in subjects typically reserved for sons. "Father allows her unprecedented freedom," Margaret wrote. "She reads Latin, studies mathematics, and yesterday I observed her examining the plantation account books with the overseer. Mother finds this unseemly, but father merely smiles and says she must understand what she will inherit. There is something almost masculine in her bearing, a directness of gaze that I find both admirable and slightly unsettling." The household staff at Pemberton Hall consisted of both field workers and house servants. Among the latter was a family that had been with the Pembertons since the plantation's founding. According to ledgers preserved in the Richmond County Archives, a woman identified only as Rachel had been purchased in 1792, already pregnant. She gave birth to a son who was named Thomas in the plantation records. Thomas himself would later father a child in 1812, a boy who would be called Marcus. What makes Marcus's presence in the household significant, according to Dr. Helena Morrison, who studied the Pemberton papers in 1964 before they mysteriously disappeared from university archives, was his unusual education. Inventory records show purchases of carpentry tools, drawing instruments, and most remarkably, books on architecture and mathematics specifically noted as for the carpenter's instruction. This was highly irregular and suggests that someone in the household was investing considerable resources in Marcus's training. The first indication that something was amiss at Pemberton Hall came in the spring of 1830. Richard Pemberton, then 53 years old, suffered what Dr. Samuel Thornton recorded in his medical ledger as a progressive illness of mysterious origin. The symptoms began with mild stomach discomfort and fatigue, gradually escalating over the course of 3 months to include violent tremors, loss of hair, and a peculiar darkening of the skin that Dr. Thornton noted resembled arsenic poisoning, though he could identify no source. Richard Pemberton died on June 15, 1830. His wife, Eleanor, who had been attending him constantly during his final illness, began exhibiting similar symptoms within 2 weeks of his death. According to the testimony of household staff, recorded during a coroner's inquiry but later sealed by court order, Eleanor had become convinced in her final days that she was being poisoned. She accused various members of the household staff, but died before she could provide specific evidence. The cause of death was listed simply as grief-induced decline, a diagnosis that Dr. Morrison's research in the 1960s would call into serious question. Catherine Pemberton, at 12 years old, found herself orphaned and the sole owner of Pemberton Hall. Legal guardianship was granted to her uncle, Jonathan Pemberton, who lived in Savannah and visited the plantation only quarterly to review accounts. The day-to-day management of the property fell to the overseer, a man named Silas Blackwell, whose reputation for brutality was noted in several contemporary accounts. What happened over the next 12 years has been pieced together from fragmentary sources. According to a letter discovered in 1958 during renovation of an old Augusta townhouse, Catherine developed an unusual relationship with the plantation's operations. She began, around the age of 14, to involve herself directly in management decisions, often overruling Blackwell's more harsh disciplinary measures. A notation in the plantation ledger from 1833 records her first major decision, the dismissal of Blackwell and the hiring of a new overseer known for more moderate methods. Most significantly, Catherine appears to have taken a particular interest in Marcus's work. Architectural drawings preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives show that between 1835 and 1840, numerous renovations were made to Pemberton Hall, all designed and executed by Marcus. These included a new wing on the mansion, elaborate gardens with geometric patterns, and most intriguingly, a private study for Catherine that featured hidden compartments and a door that could only be opened from the inside. The true nature of Catherine and Marcus's relationship remains subject to speculation, as most direct evidence was destroyed. What can be documented is that by 1840, Marcus was no longer sleeping in the carpenter's quarters with other enslaved workers, but had been given a small cottage near the main house. Plantation records show he was exempted from field work entirely and was receiving payment for his carpentry services to neighboring properties, an almost unheard-of arrangement that suggests Catherine was treating him more as a contractor than as property. Local society began to take notice. A letter from Martha Cummings to her sister in Charleston, dated March 1841, observed that Miss Pemberton conducts herself with a freedom that borders on scandalous. She is seen walking the grounds in the company of the carpenter Marcus, discussing his work as if he were an equal. Yesterday at church, she sat in the family pew but invited him to sit in the section reserved for free blacks rather than with the other slaves. Tongues are wagging throughout Augusta. The catalyst that would bring everything to a head came in the form of a marriage proposal. In May of 1842, Catherine Pemberton received an offer from Heiress and Talbot, the eldest son of a prominent Savannah family whose rice plantations made them one of the wealthiest families in Georgia. The proposal, according to letters preserved in the Talbot family papers, was not motivated by romance but by business. The union would have consolidated two fortunes and created an empire spanning both cotton and rice production. Catherine declined. Her letter of refusal, quoted in a legal document filed 3 months later, contained a curious phrase that would later be analyzed by multiple historians. I find that I have already made commitments of the heart and conscience that preclude accepting your generous offer. While I esteem your family greatly, I cannot in good faith enter into a union that would require me to abandon prior obligations of a nature I am not at liberty to fully disclose. The rejection infuriated not just the Talbot family, but Catherine's uncle Jonathan, who stood to benefit significantly from the marriage alliance. According to a deposition he gave in October 1842, he traveled to Pemberton Hall in June with the intention of assuming direct control of the plantation until Catherine came to her senses. What he discovered there, he testified, was a moral abomination that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. Jonathan Pemberton's testimony, sealed until 1963, described finding Catherine and Marcus in the library of the main house, seated together over architectural drawings and account books, discussing the plantation's business as partners rather than mistress and servant. More damning, he claimed to have observed them in a posture of intimacy that admitted no innocent interpretation. When confronted, Catherine reportedly stated that Marcus was not her property but her partner in every sense, and that she intended to free him and marry him, consequences be damned. Georgia law in 1842 presented insurmountable obstacles to Catherine's stated intentions. While she could legally manumit Marcus, any marriage between them would be void and criminal. Moreover, her uncle immediately filed a legal challenge to have her declared mentally incompetent, arguing that no woman of sound mind would willingly destroy her fortune and reputation for a relationship with a man who had been her family's property. It was against this backdrop that the infamous game of dice took place. According to multiple witnesses who testified in the subsequent legal proceedings, Catherine called a gathering at Pemberton Hall on the night of August 12, 1842. Among those summoned were her uncle Jonathan, 2 neighboring plantation owners, the county sheriff, and a notary public from Augusta. Also present was Marcus, though his presence was protested by several attendees. Catherine's proposal, as recorded by the notary, was both simple and shocking. She would wager the entire Pemberton estate, including all enslaved persons, buildings and land, against Marcus's freedom in a single game of chance. If Marcus won, he would receive not just his freedom but legal ownership of everything. If Catherine won, Marcus would agree to be sold to a plantation in Mississippi, removing him from her life forever. The proposal created an immediate uproar. Her uncle declared it madness and legally void, as enslaved persons could not own property under Georgia law. Catherine's response, recorded in the notary's account, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of legal loopholes that she must have researched extensively. If Marcus wins, she explained, I will immediately file manumission papers granting him freedom. 1 second after he becomes legally free, the property transfer will take effect, with all documents already prepared and witnessed. The entire transaction will be complete before anyone can seek an injunction. Why Catherine's uncle and the other witnesses agreed to proceed remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Some historians suggest they believed the game was safely rigged in Catherine's favor. Others propose they wanted documented evidence of her insanity to use in legal proceedings. What is certain is that all parties signed documents prepared by Catherine's attorney, a Philadelphia lawyer named Samuel Worthington who had traveled to Augusta specifically for this event. The game chosen was hazard, a dice game popular in gambling establishments of the era. According to the testimony of witnesses, Marcus selected the dice from a set Catherine provided, examined them carefully, and agreed to the terms. The room fell silent as the dice were thrown. This is where accounts become difficult to reconcile. All 6 witnesses present agreed on the outcome. Marcus won. However, their descriptions of how the dice fell vary dramatically. The sheriff testified that the dice seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment before landing. One of the plantation owners claimed the dice glowed faintly as they rolled. The notary, the most credible witness, simply recorded that the throw resulted in a clear victory for Marcus, though he noted in the margin of his document that something about the moment felt profoundly wrong, as if natural law had been temporarily suspended. What happened immediately after the dice fell moved with startling speed. Catherine signed the manumission papers. Marcus, now legally free, signed documents accepting ownership of Pemberton Hall and all its contents. The entire transaction was complete within 15 minutes, executed with a precision that suggested extensive rehearsal. The legal challenges began at dawn. Jonathan Pemberton filed emergency petitions arguing fraud, coercion, and mental incompetence. However, the documents were legally sound. Catherine had been evaluated by a physician just 2 weeks earlier and declared of sound mind, a precaution she had clearly planned for. The manumission was valid under Georgia law. And the property transfer, while morally outrageous to white society, was technically legal as it occurred after Marcus had been freed. The case went before Judge William Harrison in October 1842. The trial became a sensation, with newspapers as far away as Boston covering the proceedings. The question before the court was not whether the documents were valid, which was indisputable, but whether the entire sequence of events constituted fraud or coercion. It was during this trial that the first hints of a darker truth began to emerge. An elderly woman named Sarah, who had been enslaved on the Pemberton plantation for over 50 years, provided testimony that was immediately sealed by the judge. According to records later discovered by Dr. Morrison, Sarah testified that Marcus's grandmother Rachel had been the mistress of Catherine's great-grandfather, the plantation's founder. Rachel had possessed knowledge of herbs and medicines, knowledge she had passed down through her family line. Sarah claimed that both Richard and Eleanor Pemberton's deaths in 1830 had been caused by slow poisoning orchestrated by Marcus's father Thomas as revenge for Rachel's treatment. More disturbing still, Sarah testified that Marcus had known about these deaths and had spent the next 12 years positioning himself to complete his family's revenge. The education, the privileged position, the relationship with Catherine, all of it had been part of an elaborate plan to gain control of the very property where his ancestors had been enslaved. Whether Catherine was a willing participant in this conspiracy or had been manipulated remained unclear. Some testimony suggested she had fallen genuinely in love with Marcus and believed the game of dice to be a romantic gesture, a way to make him her equal. Other evidence pointed to her being fully aware of the revenge plot and choosing to facilitate it as her own rejection of the system that had made her family's wealth possible. The most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. During a search of Marcus's former cottage, authorities discovered a hidden compartment containing a journal. The journal, written in Marcus's hand, documented years of careful planning. Entries described studying Catherine's personality, identifying her discomfort with slavery, gradually building a relationship of trust and intellectual partnership. Later entries discussed the symbolic power of making her gamble away her inheritance, forcing her to participate in her own destruction. But the journal's final entry, dated the morning after the dice game, suggested something more complex than simple revenge. "We have won," it read, "but the victory tastes of ash." She believed the game to be about love, about creating a situation where we could be together without the stain of master and slave. She does not know the dice were weighted, that the outcome was determined years ago. I wonder if there can be redemption in freeing those who remain, or if revenge has poisoned everything it touched. Judge Harrison's ruling, issued in November 1842, was a masterpiece of legal and moral ambiguity. He found that while the transfer was technically legal, the circumstances suggested fraud or coercion of Catherine by Marcus. However, he also noted that even if the dice had been weighted, as had been alleged but not proven, Georgia law did not prohibit fraud in gambling debts between white citizens, and Marcus had been legally free at the moment the bet was paid. The judge ordered that the property transfer stand, but prohibited Marcus from selling or transferring any of the enslaved persons for 1 year, giving them time to potentially be repurchased by Catherine's relatives. The reaction was explosive. Several neighboring plantation owners organized an armed group that surrounded Pemberton Hall in late November, demanding Marcus leave Georgia immediately. Catherine, who had remained at the plantation throughout the legal proceedings, appeared on the front steps and announced that Marcus was the legal owner and anyone attempting to remove him would be trespassing. What happened that night has never been fully documented. The official record states only that a fire broke out in the early hours of November 28, 1842, and that by morning, Pemberton Hall's main house was reduced to ruins. Neither Catherine Pemberton nor Marcus were found in the wreckage. The enslaved persons on the property reported that both had departed before the fire began, taking nothing but a small trunk each. For the next decade, investigators and journalists attempted to trace their whereabouts. A ship's manifest from Savannah showed passengers named Catherine Black and Michael Blackwood departing for Philadelphia the day after the fire, but these names could not be conclusively linked to the fugitives. Property records in Canada showed a Catherine Marcus purchasing a small farm outside Montreal in 1845, but when investigators arrived, they found the property abandoned. The most intriguing lead came in 1852, when a lawyer in Boston reported being contacted by someone claiming to be Marcus regarding the sale of the Pemberton property. By this time, Catherine's uncle had died, and distant relatives had abandoned attempts to reclaim the land. Marcus, through the lawyer, sold everything in pieces over the next 2 years. The funds were transferred to an account in London and from there vanished into financial obscurity. The Pemberton plantation land was eventually subdivided and developed. The ruins of the main house were cleared in 1867. For nearly a century, the story existed only in fragmented court records and yellowed newspaper clippings, a cautionary tale whispered in Augusta society about the dangers of miscegenation and the chaos that resulted when natural social boundaries were violated. The case might have remained historical footnote if not for a series of discoveries beginning in 1955. During expansion of a cemetery adjacent to the former Pemberton property, workers uncovered a hidden burial site containing remains dated to approximately 1830. Forensic analysis, using techniques available by the 1960s, detected elevated levels of arsenic in the bones, confirming that both Richard and Eleanor Pemberton had indeed been poisoned. The most significant discovery came in 1968. An archaeological team from the University of Georgia, conducting a survey before a housing development was built, excavated the foundations of Pemberton Hall. Beneath what had been the gaming room, they found a metal box containing 2 sets of dice. One set appeared perfectly balanced. The other, when examined under laboratory conditions, was found to have been weighted with remarkable precision, using lead inserted so carefully that casual inspection would never detect it. Both sets were engraved with the initials MP. The weighted dice were older, showing wear consistent with years of practice use. The fair dice appeared almost new, suggesting they had been used only once, for the actual game. The implication was clear. Marcus had spent years perfecting his ability to control the throw with weighted dice, then switched to fair dice for the witnessed game, relying on skill rather than obvious cheating. But the most haunting artifact was found in the wall of what had been the carpenter's quarters. Hidden behind a loose brick was a small notebook containing a single entry, dated August 11, 1842, the day before the infamous game. The handwriting was identified as Marcus's. "Tomorrow night, the master's daughter throws dice with a ghost. She doesn't know she's been playing against the dead for 12 years. My grandmother Rachel, who was forced to share the founder's bed and bore his children in bondage. My father Thomas, who watched his mother die still enslaved and answered with poison. And me, born into chains but determined to break them by turning their own greed and games against them. Catherine believes tomorrow is about love, about creating a legal path for us to be together. She doesn't know the dice have already fallen, that every outcome was determined the moment she first smiled at a slave boy with a gift for numbers. I wonder what it means to win everything and lose the one thing that made victory meaningful. Perhaps that is the truest revenge of all." This discovery fundamentally altered historical understanding of the case. What had seemed like an improbable love story or a tale of manipulation was revealed to be far more complex. A multigenerational plan of revenge executed with patient brilliance, but complicated by the genuine affection that developed between conspirator and target. Dr. Helena Morrison, whose research into the case was abruptly abandoned in 1964, left notes suggesting she had discovered evidence that Catherine and Marcus did successfully establish a life together in Europe. She claimed to have found property records in Switzerland showing a couple matching their descriptions purchasing a villa near Geneva in 1855. However, her notes disappeared before she could publish, and attempts to verify her findings have been unsuccessful. What became of the 52 individuals who remained enslaved on the Pemberton property at the time of the dice game remains partially documented. Court records show that true to Judge Harrison's order, Marcus did not sell them during the probationary year. In fact, correspondence discovered in 1972 suggests that he filed manumission papers for all of them in November 1843, just before he disappeared. Whether this was part of his original plan or a decision made after Catherine's influence is unknown. The descendants of these freed individuals, some of whom remained in the Augusta area, passed down their own version of the story. According to oral histories collected by researchers in the 1970s, Marcus was remembered not as a villain but as a liberator, someone who had used the master's own games to break the chains. Catherine's role in these stories was more ambiguous, portrayed sometimes as an accomplice, sometimes as someone whose love had been weaponized without her full understanding. In 1998, during demolition of an old building in downtown Augusta that had once housed a gambling establishment, workers found a set of ivory dice hidden in a wall cavity. The dice were engraved with the initials CP and M intertwined. Analysis showed they dated from the 1840s and were perfectly balanced, with no weights or modifications. Accompanying them was a small card with a message written in fading ink: "To new games, played by new rules, where all players are free." Today, the site of Pemberton Hall is occupied by a residential neighborhood. No historical marker indicates what occurred there. Tour guides in Augusta occasionally mention the case as part of their antebellum history presentations, but the full complexity is rarely addressed. The story exists in the uncomfortable space between heroic resistance narrative and tale of manipulation and revenge. But according to local residents who live in the houses now standing where Pemberton Hall once stood, on certain summer nights when the air is thick and still, the sound of dice rolling across wooden floors can be heard echoing through their homes. Sometimes the sound is followed by laughter, whether triumphant or bitter, no one can quite determine. Some claim to hear two voices in heated discussion, a man and a woman, arguing about games and freedom and the prices we pay for both. In 2019, after Hurricane Michael caused significant damage to older structures throughout Georgia, flooding in the basement of a historic home in Augusta revealed a hidden chamber that had been sealed for over a century. Inside was a trunk containing clothing from the 1840s, architectural drawings signed by Marcus, and a woman's diary covering the period from 1840 to 1842. The diary, authenticated by handwriting experts as belonging to Catherine Pemberton, told a story more nuanced than either revenge narrative or romance. Early entries described her growing awareness of slavery's injustice, her intellectual awakening through conversations with Marcus, and her determination to find a way to grant freedom without simply perpetuating the dynamic of master granting favor to slave. Later entries revealed that Catherine had known about the weighted dice. She had discovered them months before the game and confronted Marcus about his family's history. According to her account, they had spent weeks debating what to do. Catherine's proposed solution was the public game, a spectacle that would make Marcus's freedom and ownership transfer irrevocable through community witness, while also serving as a symbolic demonstration that the entire system of property and ownership was nothing more than a game rigged by those in power. The diary's final entry, dated August 12, 1842, just hours before the dice game, read, "Tonight we throw dice for everything. He thinks it's about revenge for his family. I think it's about freeing us both from a system that made owners and property of human souls. Perhaps we're both right. Perhaps love and revenge can coexist in the same gesture. The dice are weighted, but so was every game we've played since birth, weighted by the accidents of who emerges from what womb into what circumstance. Tonight we re-weight them one last time." The discovery of this diary in 2019 remains controversial. Some historians embrace it as the final piece of the puzzle, revealing Catherine as a more active participant in her own liberation than previously understood. Others question its authenticity, suggesting it may be a later fabrication meant to retroactively justify the scandal. The diary remains in a private collection, and despite requests from multiple academic institutions, has not been made fully available for comprehensive analysis. What remains certain is that on a humid August night in 1842, two people sat across a gaming table from each other and threw dice that would determine everything about their futures. Whether that game was about love, revenge, liberation, or all three simultaneously, it represented a moment when the carefully constructed boundaries of Southern society were challenged, when the game itself was revealed as arbitrary, and when someone who should have had no power claimed it through intelligence, patience, and an understanding that every system, no matter how rigid, contains the seeds of its own undoing. The sound of those dice rolling echoes still through the architecture of American history, a reminder that beneath every established order lie countergames being played by those the system pretends don't exist, don't think, don't plan, don't feel. Marcus and Catherine stepped outside history's preferred narrative, and in doing so, they left behind a story that continues to disturb precisely because it refuses simple categorization as either tragedy or triumph. In the quiet subdivisions built atop old plantation soil, in the archives where documents appear and disappear, in the scattered dice found in walls and floors, their game continues. And the question it poses remains unanswered. In a world built on weighted games, what does it mean to truly win? What does it cost? And who really controls the dice when they leave our hands and begin to roll?